We are continuing in our series called Canceled, and we know that we live in a cancel culture, right? We live in a culture where everyone is trying to cancel everyone else. We see this in politics, we see this in religion, we see this in the education system, and we see this in entertainment. In fact, Will Smith was trying to cancel Chris Rock recently, right? I read one of the greatest jokes one of y'all posted of all times about this on Facebook. What was on Chris Rock's face after Will Smith smacked him? Fresh Prince. Oh, man. Yeah, that was horrible. I'm told by one of my coworkers, this is how you know someone's a dad without actually them telling you that they're a dad. So she says this all the time. Yes, I am a dad, and that was a horrible dad joke, but this cancel culture isn't something new. In fact, we see this back in Jesus' time. We see this in the book of Mark as we're going through that, and we see that Jesus himself faced cancellation. What he was saying, what he was doing, the changes he was trying to make, and the changes he was making to the societal and religious fabric of that time were huge. And people wanted to put a stop to it by whatever means possible. They wanted to silence him. They wanted to cancel him. And so Jesus understands cancel culture. Now, we've reached a place in our book, in the book of Mark and in Jesus' life, where things have reached a major tipping point. This is one of the most pivotal points in Jesus' ministry, and it looks like those who wanted to cancel Jesus finally got their way. It looks like they were going to finally be able to overthrow him and put a stop to what he was doing. They were jealous of how the people felt about him. They were seeing him rise up, and they were afraid that he was going to steal their position of authority and prominence in that community. And at last, they got to see their plans come to fruition. And it looks like they're going to silence Jesus after his 3 years of ministry. Jesus and his disciples are in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus spent the whole night praying to the Father because he knew what he was about to face. He knew all of the trouble, all of the torment, right? He was fully man, fully God. He communicated directly with the Father in a way that was very unique, where he heard verbally from the Father. He knew what was going to happen. And so he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he knew everything that would happen to him leading up even to the point of the cross. And so he was praying, and the culminations of his prayer that night were what we talked about last week, but I want to read it again. The culmination of his prayers that evening were this. He says, Abba, Father. He cried out in desperation to his Abba, to what the word implies is his daddy. He said, Abba, Father, take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And Mark says that he actually prayed this twice. He prayed this prayer twice. He wanted to see things change. And yet he said, I don't want to face what you're asking me to do. Just take it away. But if it interferes with what you're trying to do, God, then you do whatever has to be done so that your will be fulfilled. When Jesus prayed this prayer, not my will but yours be done, the significance of this is huge. Because we have to remember that during this sermon series, we've been talking about everyone wanting to cancel Jesus, but the reality is Jesus came to do some canceling of his own. Jesus came to cancel sin. And so how was that going to happen? When Jesus prayed, not my wills but yours be done, what he was really doing was he was committing to follow the Father's will at all cost so that he could cancel, so that he could reverse the curse of sin in your and in my life, in all of creation. Now we have to ask, where did this curse of sin come from? Well, we have to remember this came all the way back from the beginning of creation, when Adam sinned in the garden. When Adam was tempted in the garden, instead of following his father's will, what did he do? He basically, through his actions, did the exact opposite and said the exact opposite of what Jesus said. He said, essentially, with his actions, Father, not your will, but my will be done. And how often are we responsible for taking that attitude in our own lives? Even if we don't say those words, we want to do it our way. Adam was basically like, I'm going to do as I please, and look at the results of it. Look at the results. Sin entered into this world, and with it we have sickness, we have suffering, we have disease, we have depression and despair, and we have ultimately death, even spiritual death. And just as Adam represented all of mankind before God, Jesus is now representing all of mankind before God. You know, Adam was tested, and he failed the test, and he fell, and all of mankind fell with him. But when Jesus is facing the test, all of mankind can be redeemed with him. Now, just as Adam was in the garden, he was encountered by Satan, and Satan was coming before him and putting him through this test. Jesus is in a different garden, and he's facing Satan in a different way, and Satan has actually indwelled into the betrayer Judas, and he's facing the test. Will I follow the will of God that I just committed to, that I know that God the Father wants me to follow? Will I commit to that, or will I stumble? Will I give everything up that I came here to fight for? We reach a place where the Father's will intersects with Jesus' choice, and Jesus has committed to following God with all of his heart, and he's committed to following God through some of the most painful circumstances that he would ever face in his 3-year ministry. And the good news is we already know how this story ends. We know that he prevails. We know that he has victory, and that we can have victory as we entrust ourselves to him. But how did he do it? I mean, I can, there's so many situations in my life where it's just so small compared to what he's going through. He's got the weight of sin upon his shoulder. He's got all of humanity looking to him and counting on him. How did he do this? How was he able to prevail and choose victory and choose the choice of following God at all cost when he's in this place of pain and hardship? Well, I think that he sets the perfect example for us. And really, this is the question we're going to be asking ourselves today as we look at Mark chapter 14, verses 43 through 65. And the question that Jesus really answers for us is, how do I obey God's will in the middle of painful circumstances? So we're going to go ahead and look at that passage today, Mark 14, 43 through 46. Let's start by reading those verses. It says, just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Now, this is a horrible and painful moment for Jesus. There's probably nothing more painful than betrayal, than the pain of betrayal and the pain of rejection. And some of you have felt that in your own lives. And here Jesus is facing them both at once. And one of the first ways that we see Jesus tested to see if he would turn against God's will in the face of adversity is this betrayal. And it's a betrayal of someone very close to him. Some of you, again, may be going through something like that, and you can relate. You've invested in someone. There's someone in your life who you love deeply or who's been close to you for a long time. Maybe it's just someone you've been working with or someone in some other sphere that you're in, and you understand what this is like. And Jesus understands as well. Judas arrives in the garden with the crowd empowered by the Sanhedrin, and these are all of Jesus' enemies, so he's not just there to betray Jesus on his own. He brings the whole crowd with. Everyone who hated Jesus, he brings with to begin the persecution. Now, Mark makes it a point to emphasize that Judas was one of the 12. So this wasn't just some random stranger that turned on Jesus. This was someone in Jesus' inner circle. They had traveled together for 3 years. They shared meals. They probably had laughter around, the fire during cold nights. They exchanged ministry stories. Jesus invited Judas to be with him. He invested in him. He poured into him. He helped to disciple him and train him up and show him the way to live, a way that's worth living, counter to the way of the world that they were facing. He entrusted Judas with an important role of overseeing the money. And Jesus was a friend to Judas. And now Judas is turning him over even to the point of death. A painful moment in Jesus' ministry. Now, no one knows for sure exactly why he did it, but there's all sorts of, I think, overly complicated theories. One of them that I read said that maybe he was just trying to force Jesus' hand to fight. He wanted to finally see Jesus rise up and prove that he was the Messiah and take his rightful place. I personally don't believe this. I think that it was a far more selfish reason. I believe that greed and sin took over his life. And the fact is, this was not a one-time choice for Judas. Again and again, he had sinned and he had sinned. And, I've heard someone say that keeping sin in our life and thinking that we can control is kind of like keeping a tiger in the back of your yard, right, as a pet. And we may be able to feed that thing and we may be able to take care of it and there's no consequences immediately, but at some point, that sin takes over your life. And so I'm just asking you guys, what is it that you are feeding in your life that the Holy Spirit has convicted you again and again? Take this thing out of your life and you're holding on to. This should be an eye-opener for all of us that we cannot have these little pet sins in our life. We can't control sin. It's like a disease that enters into our body and it grows and it infests and it affects us and eventually overtakes us, just like it is here with Judas. Now, we're told in the Gospel of John that when a woman used an expensive perfume to anoint Jesus' feet with it basically to honor him, to show him that she loved him and believed in him essentially, that Judas was indignant. And it says in John chapter 10, verses 5 through 6, that Judas said, why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. But it goes on to say, he didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, a keeper of the money bag. He used to help himself to what was put into it. So greed entered into his heart and he became a regular thief. He chose again and again to steal. And sin eventually just took over his life. It opened up a door in his heart where at some point Satan literally was able to enter into him. He was that compromised that he was, the scriptures tell, possessed by Satan. The book of John also tells us that, or rather the book of Matthew tells us that Judas had actually betrayed Jesus for the price of 30 silvers, and that was the going rate of a slave in that time. And so you want to talk about the pain that Jesus was going through. This guy that he had invested in all of his life, and now suddenly he's being turned over and being stabbed in the back, and it's not just a stab in the back, he then takes it and he kind of twists it in. Jesus understands the pain that can come from obeying the Father's will. And this can be a huge comfort to us because we know that sometimes we obey God and things go south. I love what the book of Hebrews says. It says, because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted or tested. So Jesus can relate to the challenge. He can relate to the test of obeying God's will during painful circumstances. You are not alone. And I don't know what it is that you're going through right now. You've obeyed God, and it seems like things have only gotten worse, and you're crying out to Him. You're saying, God, I thought I was doing the right thing. Why is this happening to me? And I can tell you that Jesus understands. Jesus followed God's will, and look what happened. He understands what you're going through, and He's never going to leave you. He's never going to forsake you. He's going to walk beside you each step of the way and give you the strength and the wisdom and the words to encounter whatever situation you're being called to. And He's going to heal you at some point. But He's going to give you what you need in the moment. He can empathize with what you're going through. But what helped Jesus to obey God's will during this time? That's the big question. We're thankful that He can empathize with us, but how do we follow in His likeness? How do we follow in His pattern? What gave Him the strength to do what the Father was asking Him to do, even though He was facing all this stuff? So let's take a look at Mark 14, verses 47 through 52. And it says this: Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. And Jesus said in verse 48, He said, Am I leading a rebellion, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching you in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled. Then everyone deserted Him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus, and when they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. What a sight there. One of the things that we have to remember is that Jesus wasn't the only one to be betrayed in the garden. His disciples were betrayed too, and the person and the cause that they had given up their lives for was suddenly and seemingly being toppled with a kiss when Jesus said, Rabbi, and gave him a kiss. Right? A term of affection, a term of respect. And with that one kiss, Jesus' ministry and everything that He stood for, these disciples are watching, and they don't quite understand. Can you imagine what it must have felt like? Have you ever gone through something where it seems like it's just coming to an abrupt end? It could be a relationship, it might be a career, it might be a ministry you started, or maybe a church that you were a part of, and you poured your heart and your soul into this thing or into this person, and suddenly it's just done. It's ripped away from you. We've all been in situations like that. We've all felt that pain. But imagine having given 3 years of your life, and these disciples were just as shocked. None of them had up until this point completely understood Jesus' intentions. Not really. They knew that He was coming in to establish a new kingdom, but they had no idea how. And so they gave up their careers and their belongings and familiarities and comforts of home. Many of them faced rejection from their own family members and their friends, and obviously the religious leaders of that time. They were cut off by a lot of people because they agreed to follow Jesus. And sometimes we face that, don't we, where we choose to follow Jesus and it seems like we lose all this stuff as a result of Him. Now imagine seeing it all seemingly come to an end. All the promise that you had been told, all these prophecies and all these promises and this hope that you've invested in this person seems to be coming to an end. And now they see the one who is driving forward this new kingdom, and he was betrayed and he was arrested. Now, in the verses that we just read, and in this moment, we see several reactions from His disciple and really one reaction from Jesus. And if I could describe the disciples' reaction in a very brief way, I would say they were natural impulses in the moment. Really, they weren't well thought out. They weren't decided through a time of prayer. They weren't basing their actions on wise counsel. They reacted like a lot of us do when we're in challenging situations. We react, right? Fight, flight, or fear. They did what any one of us might have done in this situation. On the other hand, we see Jesus, and he makes this choice to follow his Father no matter what is going to happen. He did this through prayer, right? And then he chooses and he commits to submitting himself to the Father's will. And the reality is that when we're in a painful and troubling circumstance, when we're going through something, we can follow in the likeness of Jesus. We can be obedient to whatever God's called us to by following his example that we see here. Like Jesus, I too must choose God's will over natural impulses. When I'm in these painful, challenging circumstances, I just have to make a choice. I have to resolve. I have to write it in stone. I have to commit with all my heart that I am going to follow God and not just base it upon what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling in the moment. I can't choose to respond to other people's actions. I have to choose to respond to the will of God in my life at that time. Now, some of the reactions that we saw are often the kinds of reactions that we ourselves fall into. The first reaction that we saw was to fight back. And we see this in verse 47 when one of the disciples takes a swing and he cuts off a guy's ear. And now, even if we didn't know from the other Gospels who this disciple is, we all know who this disciple is. This was Peter. This is the guy that's always quick to react and quick to respond. Now, why the heck did Peter choose to chop off this guy's ear? I don't think he was aiming for the ear. I mean, this is a fisherman. He didn't know anything about handling a sword. He knew how to handle a fishing rod. And so he probably just did the best swing that he could, trying to cause the most amount of injury as possible. And so he's swinging this sword, and he's taking a swing at really probably one of the best guards in the region. This was one of the guards for the chief priest. So this would have been someone who is very well trained. Clearly, this was not a well thought out plan. And in fact, we see in the other Gospels that Jesus immediately responds and heals the guy's ear. He's like, Peter, chill out. Peter made a bad choice. But to Peter's credit, he tried to defend Jesus. He tried to fight back. Fighting back isn't always a bad choice. It's not always the wrong thing to do, but Scripture tells us that fighting injustice is great, that sticking up for the weak and the oppressed is great, but the reality is, this isn't the kind of fight that Peter was putting on at this time. He wasn't in line with God's will. He wasn't following what was supposed to be taking place. What if he had stayed up all night with Jesus and he had prayed with him when Jesus implored him and John to stay awake and pray? Remember, instead of doing that, he fell asleep. But Jesus had said, watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Is it possible that Peter would have made a different choice at this time? Is it possible that Peter would have been more in line with the will of God at this time instead of simply responding and lashing out and fighting? The reality is we too have to be careful to guard our hearts in those moments when we want to fight back the most, when we have those choice words and we know exactly what to say to kind of get back. Or maybe it's a situation where you're trying to get ahead, or maybe it's a situation where you're just trying to get revenge. We have the choice to immediately respond to that fight inclination, that fight impulse. But the reality is that we have to make a choice ahead of time. Am I going to follow God's will? And that starts with spending time with God in His Word, committing to His will. It starts with us desperately seeking for God's help and His guidance on a daily basis and submitting whatever situation it is in our life that's causing that pain, that's causing that trauma or that trouble. We have to submit that before God in prayer. We can't take that into our own hands. When we do that, we fall, we fail, and we follow the whole fight instinct. Another natural impulse that we see of the disciples was to follow fear. And we see this in verses 50 through 52. When the disciples had fully grasped that Jesus was being arrested, they fled, right? They ran off. They were afraid for their lives. And Mark, again, he points out that one of the disciples actually lost his clothes in the struggle and as he ran away. And some people actually think this would be Mark, right? So how many disciples were probably in the garden with him? It was probably the 12. There maybe even a few others, but it was probably the 11. Obviously, Judas was off betraying him. But it's very possible that Mark was sort of acknowledging his own sort of shame in the moment. And the reason that Mark brings this up is also to kind of mention that there is a shame associated with fleeing. At least there was in this moment of running away. No one was coming to arrest the disciples. In fact, Judas was really careful to make sure that, he clearly identified who Jesus was. They weren't coming to arrest him. They never indicated that they were coming to get him. Why didn't they stick with Jesus? Why didn't they follow him and work together to defend him before the court that he was being taken before? But instead they fled, thinking only of themselves in the moment, and the reason is they were scared. They let fear take control of their hearts and their minds and control their actions. And if we're not careful, we too can allow fear to control our actions instead of allowing God to control us. So let's get real for a moment. Some of you, you know that there is something God's been asking you to do, and you're just afraid, and you're not willing to do it. It might be a sin that you've been harboring for years, and God has said, I want you to confess that sin. I want you to go to this person and tell them what you're doing, and I want you to follow my will no matter what the results are. It might get painful, it might get hard, it might cause trouble in your relationship, but I want to free you from this sin, and I want to build a new relationship in your life, and I want to make it healthier than ever before. Will you obey me? Will you confess that sin to the person that you need to confess to? It could be forgiveness. It could be that you are holding a grudge against someone and they have a place in your life. I'll tell you, I started this sermon and I woke up in the morning and there's someone I hadn't thought about in years, and this person was sitting in the front row watching me as I was praying and preparing for this, and God was saying, I need you to forgive this person. And I know that in some of your lives there is a person that you need to forgive. There's someone who's wounded you deeply, and there isn't necessarily a clear path forward, but what is the first step that you're going to take to follow God in obedience? We know that God has forgiven us of so much, and the Bible says we can't be like the person who's been forgiven a lifetime worth of sin and hold one sin against someone else. Like, God has forgiven us, he's freed us, and we now have this eternity with him. He's given us so much that we don't deserve. Are we going to follow in his likeness and forgive? Some of you just might need to have a conversation with someone, a crucial conversation, a difficult conversation that you've been putting off for a long time. Some of you just need to take a step of faith in a new direction. God has something new and exciting, but it involves risk, and you're not willing to do it because you're letting fear overtake you. God wants to free you from fear. He wants you to follow him in faith. He wants you to achieve the life that he's promised, the abundance life that he's promised each and every one of us if we would follow him and be obedient. So we see two reactions. We see fight back and we see follow in fear. Those are two common reactions, fight and really flight here. But the third reaction we see is from Jesus. And Jesus, his reaction was to faithfully obey. Mark 14, verse 49 says that Jesus was focused on his Father's will, right? He said, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. He knew exactly what had to happen. He knew what he had committed to, and he acknowledged that the scriptures, the prophecies must be fulfilled. And so he was focused on his Father's will alone, not on what he was feeling or thinking in the moment, but what God had told him to do. He wasn't going to try to flee. Jesus was never one who would run in fear, but he could have fought. I mean, we've seen him do some interesting things, right? In the temple, overturning money-changing tables. I mean, Jesus is fully God and fully man. He had full access to everything, all the powers of heaven. The book of Matthew says, "Are you not aware that I can call on my Father, and he will," and this is the same story, by the way, "and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way?" Jesus could have called 12 legions of angels, and that's an astounding number. That's at least, by some estimates, 72,000 angels. That's an excessive, overwhelming show of force that would have absolutely obliterated any opposition in a blink of an eye. In fact, you look in the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah is telling a story, and he says that there was a story where one angel had killed 185,000 men in one night. So if one angel could do that, imagine 72,000 angels coming down. Like Jesus was not lacking in strength or resources to fight back. He chose not to. And I want you to know that Jesus has all the resources that he needs to stop anything that needs to be stopped in your life, to put an end to any sort of hard circumstance that is in your life, any sort of painful circumstance. He has the power and the strength and the resources to help you get from point A to point B, maybe a goal that you've been aiming for, a new career, or something along those lines. He has all the strength and the resources to do it. But sometimes he doesn't. Why? Because he wants to see the Father's will take place in your life just as it was in his life. And so sometimes we're crying out to God, take this away, or please God, give me this. And God's like, no, I'm not giving you that, and I'm not taking this away because I know the bigger picture. And I want you to follow God's will just as I've followed God's will. Jesus was perfectly submitted, he was obedient, and he was aligned with his Father's will and all the prophetic scriptures that he said have to be fulfilled. And I guess it's important for us to realize that this is a huge moment of prophecy being fulfilled. Jesus could have been referring to Psalm 41:9 when it says, "Even my close friends in who I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me." Could be referring to Judas. Or maybe he's referring to Isaiah 53:8, "By opposition and judgment he was taken away." He may have also been thinking of Zechariah 13:7, "And they all left him and fled." God's will, as prophesied over thousands and thousands of years, would be fulfilled perfectly because Jesus chose to perfectly obey the Father. Now, each one of us has a choice of how we're going to respond. We can fight, we can flee in fear or follow that fear, or we can faithfully obey God, but we have to make a choice in advance. Will we allow our natural impulses in the moment to override the situation, to override God's will? Are we going to allow those desires to dictate our response to painful and challenging circumstances? Or are we going to follow God's will? Are we going to follow in the footsteps of Jesus? That's a hard choice that each one of us has to make. Now, so far we've seen Jesus' perfect example in obeying God after being betrayed by Judas in this Garden of Gethsemane, and we see the story now shifting to a new location where his accusers are sitting there and they're waiting for him, and they're just waiting to get a chance to bite at him and to really follow through with the whole idea of canceling him, right? So we're going to work through the next 12 verses quickly, but there's one more important lesson that Jesus, I think, can teach us on obedience in painful circumstances, and I'll talk about that closer to the end of these verses, but as a heads up, there's 12 more verses. We've got 6 more minutes, so I know it took a little bit longer to get for the first half. We're not going to keep you too long. I won't be like Brian. Where's Brian? I'm just kidding. Oh, there he is. I'm just kidding, Brian. Just kidding. And you're fired. All right. So, verse 53 through 54, we see that Jesus is taken before the Sanhedrin. So 53 says, they took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Now, basically, Jesus is taken before all of his enemies, as we kind of talked about. And the Sanhedrin was essentially like the supreme court of that time. It was a consolidation of all these different people with different political positions. They had different religious differences, but the one thing that they could agree upon is that they wanted Jesus dead. Verse 54 says that Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, where he sat with the guards and warmed himself by the fire. And by the way, this should be kind of something that we need to reflect on in our own lives. Are we going to seek that comfort, right? Are we going to seek that comfort in the time of need, right? Of a friend's life, or maybe just a time where we're supposed to be following God. We're supposed to be doing something a little bit differently. We can fall into the same kind of trap that Peter fell into and just be comforted. And we see here that not even Peter. Now, Peter was one of Jesus' closest disciples, and you might even call him one of Jesus' best friends. Not even Peter was beside Jesus' side at this moment when he was brought before his enemies. So this is, again, just things get progressively more and more painful for our Lord. In verse 55 through 56, we see that Jesus is falsely accused. Verse 55 says the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against him, against Jesus, so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. So this was clearly not a fair trial. They were falsely testifying against him. He was being brought before the Sanhedrin not to face justice, but to face injustice. They were trying to kill him. In verse 57 through 59, Jesus is misunderstood. He's misrepresented. 57 says, then some stood up and gave a false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another not made with hands. Yet even their testimonies did not agree. Now, Jesus never said he was going to rebuild a temple made with human hands. They took his words and they twisted it. His exact words were, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. He was talking about himself. He was talking about his body. But they took his words, and whether they were intentionally manipulating him to accuse him, or these were honest misrepresentations, we don't know. But he was very clearly misunderstood and misrepresented here. So what was Jesus' response to this all? Jesus finally and blatantly reveals to his enemies that he's the Messiah. In verse 60 through 62, it says, starting with verse 60, then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Now, the priest wasn't happy with this response. Remember, his intention was to kill Jesus. He wanted Jesus to say something that would incriminate him, self-incrimination. He wanted to condemn Jesus to death, so he tries a second time. And he asks more poignantly, he says, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus simply says, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, Jesus' response to this trial and this persecution that he was facing was absolutely perfect. He didn't get lured into all the gossip and all the lies. Even more importantly, he didn't get distracted by the results of his obedience. Remember, everything that he's done up until this point has just led to something worse and to something more painful. But that didn't deter Jesus to commit to his Father's will and in the end perfectly fulfill thousands of years of prophecy about him. So what helped him to maintain this posture of obedience again and again, even though the immediate results weren't looking very good for him? He focused on the final outcome. And Jesus, he sets the perfect example for us when it comes to obeying God, because for us too, to obey God, I must focus on the final outcome, not the immediate results of my obedience. I'll say that again. I must focus on the final outcome, not the immediate results of my obedience. We see that the immediate results of Jesus' obedience was betrayal. He was brought before his enemies. He was ridiculed. He was falsely accused. He was misunderstood and misrepresented. His friends and his followers had abandoned him. One of his closest friends comforted himself while he himself suffered. If Jesus had focused on these things to determine whether or not he would obey, if he thought to himself, good results, and I'm going to keep on obeying, bad results, and I'm going to give up, then Jesus would have lost everything that he came to fight for. Instead, Jesus focused on the bigger picture. He said, I am the Messiah. And he was also alluding to the fact when he said, I am, that he is God, alluding back to what God would say about himself. He was essentially saying, I know my purpose and I will not give up. I have been sent here by my Father to seek and save the lost, and I will accomplish my mission. Not only that, but someday you will see me as the true and righteous King and ruler of this earth, sitting next to my Father in glory, and I'll be back. I love this part. This time he's going to be back not as one tormented and ridiculed and mocked and betrayed by these people before this kangaroo court. He says, I'm coming back as the prophecies predict on the clouds of heaven to righteously judge the earth, and the tables are going to be turned. You'll be standing before me, and I'll be judging you. And as you can imagine, this really ticked them off. This was not a happy moment for them. But what we see here is that Jesus was intensely focused on the bigger picture. He was not focused on the immediate results. He stayed focused on the final outcome so that he could maintain this obedience through this trying time. And I don't know what some of you guys are going through. There's a million different situations. It might be a bad marriage. It could be an unfair work situation. And as much as you want to fight back in a certain way, or as much as you want to run, God is telling you to do something differently, and it just keeps on getting more and more painful. It could be the betrayal of a friend, or maybe a family member, or maybe even a mentor that you trusted. Jesus knows what you are going through. He's experienced your pain. He knows what it's like to obey God in all circumstances. And I just encourage you to look at the bigger picture. Look at the final reward of following God just as Jesus did. There's no promise things are going to get better, not here on earth, but God promises that you will be saved, you will be restored, you will be eventually healed, and the glories that await you are far greater than any suffering that you're going to experience in this world. So hold on to what God has told you to do, even when everything inside of you is saying, I give up. God says, no, hold on. Keep going forward. Follow in my footsteps. Now, what if Jesus didn't take this bigger picture attitude even here? What if he hadn't done that? Well, if he had actually given up now, he definitely would have given up, as we see in the next two verses in verse 63 through 65, if he is focused on the results and not the bigger picture. So if he hadn't given up, he definitely would have given up next, because what happens next is that Jesus is unofficially condemned to death. And so this is not yet the legal court, but basically his whole society had decided you're guilty and we're going to make sure you die. And so verse 63 says the high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses, he asked. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him, and with their fist, and said, prophecy. And the guards took him and beat him. Now the reality is that what we actually see here is an insult. They're saying prophecy was actually, ironically, saying exactly what was taking place here. Jesus had followed the Father's will perfectly through such a horrible and trying time. He set the perfect example for us, and he fulfilled prophecy. And I pray for each one of us today that we too can follow in his footsteps no matter what. I'm going to ask the band to come up. We're going to worship God one last time. But before we do that, I want to pray for you guys. I want to pray for myself, just that we can maintain that attitude of obedience no matter what we've gone through. And I know that some of you are going through such hard and challenging circumstances, but God is with you. He's going to see you every step of the way. Just as he's gone through it, you too can go through it. Remain in him, and you're going to begin to bear the fruit that he wants to see in your life, in your relationship, in that situation. So let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your goodness. We thank you for your faithfulness. We thank you that we're not alone, that we can look to you as the faithful example of obeying God no matter how hard things get. God, we just pray that we can have that same level of obedience. We see already how much you have suffered for us because you wanted to save us, because you wanted to spend eternity with us, because you love us. Lord, help us to be willing to suffer with you when things get tough, when we want to give up, when we don't see things turning out the way we hope they would. Give us the faithfulness that you have, God. We cannot do this on our own, God. We ask you to help us, and we ask all this in your precious name. Amen.